Today I'm going to show you guys 3 really important ideas that you should keep in mind if you want to improve your drums. The first thing I want to talk about when it comes to improving your drums is a topic that has a lot of confusion around it. It's the concept of layering, something that I'm sure you've heard of before. But it can be really difficult sometimes to figure out what types of sounds you should layer on top of your drums and how you should go about doing so. I think keeping this framework in mind that I'm going to show you guys in this video is really going to help you out if this is something that you have issues with. The first thing I want to talk about is the idea of content and character. This is something that I talked about before. So I have this beat here that I played for you guys in the intro. And by the way, if you enjoy my videos, please do subscribe. It's just one click away if you guys get tired of seeing my videos, but it really does help my channel out. So when it came to building this beat out, this is a concept that I kept in mind, the idea of content and character. Initially, this is the drum pattern that I had in the beat. As you guys can hear, these are very typical drum sounds. These are probably sounds that you all have in your drum library as well. And these sounds aren't very remarkable. They don't stand out by any means, but that's sort of the point. This is the content layer. You guys can hear, they just do the job of what drums should do in a beat. They just provide the utility part. They're very dry, they're very immediate, and they sit very forward in the beat. The space that these sounds take up are very distinct and very pronounced, and the drums themselves are very punchy. Now at this point, I wanted to introduce a bit more character into these sounds. So I decided to layer these sounds on top of my drums. And you guys can hear this layer really helped my drums stand out and be a lot more unique. This is the character layer. But what's interesting is that if I were to just solo those character drums and remove the content drums, you guys can hear how this beat would sound. The drums, while they do provide a nice amount of texture into the beat, they don't actually do what drums need to do in a beat. These drums here, they sound very frail, very weak, and they're just not cutting through in the mix. So when it comes to drums, taking this dualistic type of approach or keeping this type of framework in mind can be really helpful. Thinking of your drums as whether they provide content or character and making sure you encompass both of those can be really helpful if you're trying to play around with the idea of layering. So you can first focus on building out one of these layers, whether it be the content or the character, and then you can move on to building out the other layer in your beat. And using this type of dualistic approach is going to make it a little bit more simple to build out some nice dense drums for your beats. And at this point, I can easily control just how much of these layers I actually want in the beat. For example, if I want my drums to be a little bit less dense and a little bit more character driven, I can easily go into my mixer. I can grab my content drums and just bring the volume down. Now there are a few things that I want to point out if you do plan on taking this approach. EQing is going to be very important here. What I did was I looked at the frequency spaces that the content drums took up, and I made sure that the character drums didn't take up a similar space. For example, if I look at my content oriented snare here are the frequencies that I decided to boost as well as keep using this EQ band here. Now going into my character oriented snare, you guys can see what I did with the EQ here. I focused on a slightly different space here. If I went in and I boosted the exact same frequencies as my content oriented snare, it wouldn't make much sense. I already have a snare that's already pretty dense and prominent in that frequency space, so what's the point of adding more into those spaces? Instead, I decided to carve out a more unique space for this character driven snare here. Same thing with the hi-hat here. Here is the space that the content oriented hi-hat takes up, and this is the frequency that I decided to boost for this hi-hat. And looking at the character-oriented hi-hat, it's a completely different space. So this might be something that's going to be a helpful tool if you want to use this approach, thinking about exactly where each of your layers sit in terms of their frequency space, and make sure you shift them around so they don't get in the way of each other. That way you're going to end up with a lot more of a well-rounded drum loop just because you have a lot more sounds taking up their own distinct spaces in the overall frequency space of your beat. But this leads me to my next point, which is, should you even be layering to begin with? Let's take a listen to the other sounds in this beat here that aren't drums. Layering isn't something that you necessarily want to do in every single beat that you make. Obviously, if your drums sound weak, layering is going to be a very helpful tool to improve your drums, but for a second here, let's take a step back in the beat making process. Layering, and especially adding more character into your drums, has its own time and place that you should be doing it. As you guys just heard, this beat that I was working on wasn't necessarily the most complex beat. There's no complicated melody, there aren't any huge dense chords. Overall, there just isn't as much going on in this beat. It's a pretty minimal beat, so if I were to go ahead and take some plain, straightforward sounding drums, the beat might not sound as full and it might end up sounding a little bit more tame and timid. So in a situation like this, where your beat just doesn't have as much going on in it, it might be a good idea at that point to add a little bit more density into your beat using your drums. But on the flip side, if you have a beat that's really full and it has a lot of layers in it, at that point it might be a good idea to be a little bit more conservative with your drums and be a little bit more straightforward and utilitarian with them. As you guys will remember, in a video I made a little while back on how to get your beats to sound professional, one of the things that I talked about in that video was this idea that you just cannot have too many sounds be in the spotlight. So taking your drums and making them far more dense by adding more character into them when you already have a lot of other sounds in your beat that are already doing that might end up making your beat sound a lot more cluttered. So that's something that you might want to keep in mind if you're trying to figure out whether or not you should layer your drums. Next up, the third and final point that I want to talk about is the idea of cohesion. A lot of the times when I hear beats that are made by beginners, one of the things that I keep running into is the sort of Frankenstein type of feel to their drums, where none of the drum sounds really have much in terms of commonality that ties them together, and there's a really detached feeling amongst all the different sounds. And there is a lack of cohesion amongst all the different elements. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, there is definitely a time and place when this aesthetic works. But if you're trying to get your drums to sound as if they are coming from the exact same drum break, there is an idea here that you need to keep in mind. What you want to do is create some consistency amongst all the different sounds, so here's a technique that will help you out here. What you can do is use the same sound for multiple elements in your beat. Meaning, let's say you wanted to introduce some more percussive noises into your beat. Instead of going into your drum library and looking up percussion noises, what you can do is use some of these sounds that you already have in your beat. For example, in this beat here, I have this percussive noise right here. All I did to create this noise was I took my initial layered snare right here, this character snare. I duplicated it out. And at this point, I just combed through the sound using the sample start time to see if I could find a different section of the exact same sound that has a bit of a different tonality to it. You can also play around with the pitch, maybe pitch it up or down slightly, a few cents. Therefore, I have a sound that doesn't necessarily sound exactly like my main snare, introducing a little bit more detail and texture into my beat. But at the same time, the sound that I'm introducing does have some consistency with the other sounds in the beat. That way we don't get this detached feeling with our drums, and we create a little bit more cohesion in the beat with the different drum sounds that we have here. Same thing with this drum fill that I have here. This is a small little element that I have in my overall drum loop, but what I ended up doing here was I duplicated this sound out and I used this as my layered kick right here. I just isolated one of those hits that you guys heard. And I just layered this sound on top of my kick, so now there's a little bit more cohesion between those elements as well. So again, I just reused a sound that was already in my beat to create a little bit more cohesion in the beat overall, just to tie all the sounds together. So those are the ideas that I want to show you guys today if you want to improve your drums, keeping in mind the idea of content, character, as well as cohesion. If you guys have enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. My free drum kit's available in the description box below, as well as a link to the Discord. I do beat reviews every 2 weeks, so if you want to join in the fun, head over to my Discord, and I will see you guys next time.